Let's stir up a little TNFT, shall we? We'll turn back the clock on this Thursday for a rematch of Super Bowl 53, a game where the Pats completely shut down Jared Goff and company in a 13-3 win. The 3 points allowed is tied for the fewest in Super Bowl history, and if it were a fantasy game, Goff would have gotten you just 7.16 points. That total is far from this one. Goff is your highest scoring fantasy Ram on Thursday Night Football. He scored 39.3 points in Week 4 of 2018. Goff had 5 touchdown passes to 4 different players. In total, he threw for 465 yards against the Vikings secondary, which included a 70-yarder to Cooper Kupp. You have to go further back to find the highest scoring Patriot on Thursday Night Football. It's Matt Castle, who put up 36.2 fantasy points thanks to 400 passing yards and 3 touchdowns against the Jets back in Week 11 of 2008. The closest Patriot to him since is Rob Gronkowski, who scored 32.4 in Week 1 of 2015. As for New England's current quarterback, perhaps it's Newton's new law. Cam's been a great RB1 for managers, not so much of a passer. His 5 passing touchdowns rank tied for 35th, getting just 7.7 fantasy points per game, and his 11 rushing touchdowns rank first with 10.1 fantasy points per game. But his combined totals from both facets of his game, just 17.8, which ranks 14th among fantasy quarterbacks this season. Time to see who's going to feast and who you should fade in tonight's game. I will give you each a player. You tell me whether or not he's going to go off or whether or not you should pass on him, either in season-long or in daily lineup. So, Cynthia, we will start with the aforementioned Cameron Jarrell Newton. Do you feast or fade?
So in regular seasons, I am fading him. Perhaps in some daily formats, I would play him. However, this isn't a great matchup because the Rams defense have been extraordinary through the air and on the ground. If you look to see what they're doing, Next Gen Stats provides a really cool note here. When they have light boxes, which is kind of what the advantage a mobile quarterback like Cam Newton has, they draw defenders out of the box and then they can just run right up the field. Yeah, the Rams don't let that happen. Only 4.6 yards per rush against a light box allowed. That is 6th best in the NFL. And by the way, when they load the box, they are best in the NFL. So this is not a good matchup for Newton for fantasy purposes.
All right, Kimmy, we talked about Jared Goff and how he struggled against the Patriots in the Super Bowl. Tonight, though, against New England, does he feast or fade?
I think Jared Goff's like a little snack. It's a little snack situation. Let me start by saying I love how he's been playing fantasy football lately. He's had 300-plus passing yards in 4 of the last 5 games and 23-plus points in 2 of the last 3 games. Those are very good stats. However, they are playing the New England Patriots, who just shut out Justin Herbert and the Los Angeles Chargers. The matchup concerns me since the Patriots are allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. So I'm not going full fade, but I'm not going full feast. So it's just a snack check mix situation here.
All right, Florio, we hand the dish to you now. Damian Harris, who I have been a fan of most of the year against this Ram defense, feast or fade?
I think you fade Damian Harris tonight. You heard Cynthia talking about how great the Rams are at stopping the run, and if you were expecting Damian Harris to maybe get involved in the passing game, you shouldn't be. He has 1 target or fewer in 8 of 9 games this year, and he has 4 receptions all year. That's barely in the top 100 amongst running backs. And also, the Rams have not allowed a top 15 running back in 10 straight games, and just 2 running backs at top 20 points against them this whole season. I think in a tough matchup, you fade Damian Harris tonight.
I'm going to look at Cam Akers, and maybe it is a little bit of recency bias from last week, but I'm going to say I think he feasts tonight. He had a 65% snap share last week, which is the highest by any Rams running back all season. Now, he's faced 8 or more in the box on 45% of his runs, but that's not a thing the Patriots do a lot of. So I expect that they're going to try and shut down Jared Goff the way they did in the Super Bowl, force the Rams to win the game on the ground. So I think that means a lot of opportunities for Cam Akers. Let's just hope that Sean McVay doesn't pull a fast one on us and go back to that 3-headed attack that we saw earlier in the year. All right, we'll come back around Cynthia. What about Cooper Kupp? Is he a feast or fade tonight?
So I have him as pretty fed, as in 12.1 fantasy points, 6 receptions for 61 yards. So pretty well fed. The touchdown is not a certainty. The Patriots defense is not a great one to kind of match up against. But I do love him for daily purposes. If you want to create a lineup with him, I do think he's fully playable in that format.
Okay, we can't talk about Cooper Kupp without talking about Robert Woods. How are you feeling about Bobby Trees?
All right, if Cynthia thinks that Cooper Kupp's going to get fed, I said Jared Goff is going to be a snack. Let's say Robert Woods is a subtle feast. The Patriots have not allowed a top 25 fantasy wide receiver in 3 straight games. However, Robert Woods, he's a top 15 receiver on this season. He's had 15-plus fantasy points in 3 straight games. And sadly, he is my favorite receiving option. I'm sorry, Cynthia. I got to rock with Bobby Trees on this one.
Well, Cynthia will be back later on in the hour. She'll be with us all hour, but she will be on later in the hour to help set a daily lineup in Best Day Ever. In the meantime, it is Thursday night football, just a few hours from kickoff between the Patriots and the Rams. 7:30 p.m. Eastern on NFL Network, Fox, and streaming on Prime Video. And don't miss NFL Game Day kickoff coming up right after us at 6 p.m. Eastern. Time to look at some headlines, just in case you missed it. For fantasy managers who are hoping for the return of Christian McCaffrey just in time for their playoffs or play-in game this week, not going to like this news. CMC did not practice today after feeling the effects of a quad injury he suffered last week in a personal workout. Head coach Matt Rule says he is not expecting McCaffrey to play. Now, CMC has been trying to return from his shoulder injury and has only played in 3 games this season. So, Florio, what advice do you have for any managers who might look to start Mike Davis this week against the Broncos?
Yeah, my condolences to anyone who drafted Christian McCaffrey, but hopefully you have Mike Davis as a backup. He started off great when Christian McCaffrey went out, and I know he's cooled off a little bit as of late, but he is still averaging 15.5 fantasy points per game without McCaffrey this year. He is seeing over 18 touches per game when McCaffrey sits. And that opportunity could once again lead to some good fantasy production, as Denver has allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs since week 8. So with the matchup and the opportunity being there, I think if you lost Christian McCaffrey, you just pivot to his backup in Mike Davis.
Also interesting to keep an eye on DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel, who were placed on the COVID list earlier in the week. Raiders running back Josh Jacobs remains sidelined at today's practice. Returned to practice, I should say, with an injured ankle that kept him out of last week's game against the Jets. Fantasy managers will want to see if he practices, though, again on Friday. Devontae Booker had just 6 fantasy points on 50 yards rushing in relief last week. So, Kimmy, is Booker someone you can roll with this week if you're maybe a little bit desperate?
I don't know. Maybe in a daily format if you just want to YOLO it. But if you are in the fantasy playoffs and you're in a must-win situation, I don't know if Booker is the guy. We wanted him to be hot last week when he filled in for Josh Jacobs, and he was able to get 17 touches, but he just didn't have that production that we wanted in terms of fantasy points. Now, understand that the Colts defense, they were good at the start of the season, but then as of late, they've allowed a top 10 fantasy running back in 2 of the last 3 games. I think, obviously, if Josh Jacobs plays, you want to fire him up, but I would just temper any expectation you have for Devontae Booker fully filling that void.
NFL insider Ian Rappaport says Saints quarterback Drew Brees is progressing well in his rehab from a lung puncture and fractured ribs, but he still hasn't practiced with the team. His realistic target to return is next week against Kansas City. So, Cynthia, a lot of folks picked up Taysom Hill weeks ago. They have been winning with him in their lineup. What are your projections for Taysom this week against the Eagles?
Yeah, you should also play him this week. I have about 25 fantasy points projected for him, 222 passing yards, 2 touchdowns to pick, and 39 rush yards, and a rushing touchdown. That's a really great day. That Eagles front is really the problem of this whole team. And you know how you stop pressure coming right in your face? Yeah, you run right at it, which is exactly what Taysom Hill does. Scrambles, runs, kind of makes things happen with his legs. So for me, he falls into the top 10 amongst all quarterbacks this week. You should absolutely be playing him.
Taysom Hill throwing a touchdown pass last week was kind of a happy learned how to putt moment. Good news for Bucs wideout Chris Godwin. His pins have been removed from his broken finger. Godwin was a full participant in practice today, catching passes for the first time with no pins. Note, Mike Evans did not practice as he's dealing with an injured hamstring. So, Florio, how much do you like Godwin Sunday against the Vikings?
I have Godwin currently ranked as a wide receiver 2. And that's what he's kind of been since Antonio Brown has signed here. In that span, in those 4 games, he's averaging 14.5 fantasy points and about 8 targets. But if Mike Evans sits, the upside is sky high because the Vikings have allowed the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers, and they're very prone to giving up deep passes. So you have to monitor Mike Evans. I think you play Godwin either way, but if Evans sits, you obviously like Godwin even more.
fewer targets in that Bucs passing game will probably make everybody feel a little bit better. James Conner was removed from the COVID-19 reserve list and is expected to return this week at Buffalo. Managers may want to proceed with caution, however, since the Steelers' running game once employed the bus. Now it has been on the struggle bus. Pittsburgh has had 28 carries from the opponent's 5-yard line or closer, but only 9 touchdowns to show for it. Conner hasn't had a 100-yard game since week 6. So, Cynthia, what do you project for James Conner on Sunday?
Another not 100-yard rushing game for him, 68, a rushing touchdown, 2 receptions, 17. I want to caution, the O-line has been pushed back. The shifts that we're used to from them, they're not getting that same push that we've seen from their O-line in years past. So that's kind of a problem. So temper your expectations for the upside for James Conner and kind of go right around that median or maybe even lower. That's where I'm projecting him this week.
Falcons wide receiver Julio Jones did not practice for the second straight day with an injured hamstring. Jones has been dealing with this injury for much of the season, and he's just the wide receiver 33 on the year, scoring only 3 times. So if you've got Calvin Ridley or Russell Gage this week at the Chargers, understand that they are likely to get some more opportunities. But one thing to keep in mind, where Ridley's production has stayed fairly flat with or without Julio Jones, Russell Gage has actually been much better with Julio on the field than without. If you are feeling really frisky, maybe you look toward Olamide Zaccheaus, but otherwise I think you're probably better off looking outside this Falcons roster for some wide receiver help.
Welcome back to Fantasy Live. It's time to raise your game, presented by EA Sports Madden NFL 2021. Michael and I are here looking ahead to 2021. This is the year we cannot get to 2021 fast enough. Okay, Michael, give me a pair of rookies who have secured themselves an early round fantasy draft pick for 2021.
Yeah, I think James Robinson is going to go from undrafted in 2020 to the first round of 2021 fantasy drafts. He's currently the RB6 in fantasy. He's the only running back to give you double-digit fantasy points in every single game this year. Him and Derrick Henry are the only backs to see 16-plus touches in every game, and he's third amongst all running backs in snaps played. He's top 6 in carries, rush yards, targets, catches, touchdowns, and fantasy points. Basically, what I'm saying is if you like production and you like winning in fantasy football, you should draft James Robinson in the first round next year. And another rookie that I like, Cynthia, is one that I know you like as well, DeAndre Swift for the Lions. He has missed the last couple of weeks, but before that, in his first start, he went off for over 25 fantasy points. He had 21 touches. He put a season high in basically every category, and before that, he was already very consistent, giving double-digit fantasy points in 7 of 9 games. They've already used him a lot in the passing game. I think he is showcased enough to get fantasy managers excited next year, where they'll be talking about drafting him at the end of the first, maybe early second round at the latest.
I love that one. Obviously, I actually love both of those. I'm actually looking at Justin Jefferson, who obviously to me has emerged as your top rookie wideout. That one seems pretty obvious. But next season, he's going to be a top 5 pick at the wideout position, kind of overall for the entire draft. Why? One, consistency. We know who's quarterback's going to be. We know what the scheme's going to be like. That's a big plus going forward. And his 17.43 fantasy points per game, that ranks 9th among wide receivers now. That figures to go up even more with more experience and more kind of adjustment to NFL-style defenses. And then another guy who's also going to have the same quarterback next season, T. Higgins. He ranks 36th among wide receivers. I think he's going to be like a second or third round guy. It depends on, kind of the metrics of how your team does scoring. But his 13.06 fantasy points per game, that to me, that's like the floor for next season. He had 10 plus in 9 of his last 10 games. Nothing but upside. Once Joe Burrow gets back, he's his favorite target. It's going to be really fun to see him grow in the next season. Now, from those young bucks to this Vegas duo who hit the jackpot in week 13.
Richard goes out, pass, touchdown, wide open is Waller.
Well, I can't get any easier than that.
Fires in, just fire, breaks a tackle over there is Waller. Inside the 20, the 10, end zone, goes in for the touchdown. Darren Waller, a run after the catch for the Raiders, touchdown. Jackpot, baby. What an afternoon for Waller, who has 2 touchdowns on the game. Hope you put him on your fantasy team today.
Hey, if you did have Darren Waller on your fantasy team, congrats. That was your top stack from week 13. It was Derek Carr Darren Waller. This is the very first time this season that a tight end has been one half of the top stack. But Marcus Grant and I are here to give you our favorite stacks for week 14. If you did not make the fantasy playoffs, do not go and tune us out because we're also talking to you. We're going to give you some stacks that can have you run in to the bank to hit your jackpot in the daily formats. Marcus, can I please do the honor and go first? I'm so fired up about this one.
Please,
I got to hit
by
it.
all means.
I feel like I'm on
By all
hype
means.
train. I'm like, show me Ryan Tannehill and Corey Davis. Here we go. Okay. Hey. All right, Ryan Tannehill is coming off an almost 400 passing yard game with 3 passing touchdowns, finishing as a top 4 quarterback above guys like Russell Wilson and Patrick Mahomes. Now, though I also like A.J. Brown as a receiving option, I've got my eyes on Tannehill and Corey Davis against the Jags on Sunday. Davis just put up 35 points and 182 receiving yards in week 13, plus a score. He's had double-digit fantasy points in every game played this season, and both of these guys are easy starts against the Jags, who are within the top 5 for most fantasy points allowed to both fantasy quarterbacks and fantasy wideouts this season. Marcus, what's your stack?
Well, I definitely dig that one too because Ryan Tannehill is very underrated, I think, in terms of what he's done this year. I'm going to go with one that seems like low-hanging fruit, but I always say low-hanging fruit, it tastes just as good as the stuff at the top of the tree. You don't have to reach as hard to get it. Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams, who have been fantastic all year long. They have combined to score 50 or more fantasy points 5 different times this season. And this week, they get their shot at the Detroit Lions, who've given up the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 6th most to wide receivers. I mean, look, these two guys have been lights out, and I know plenty of people were able to get both of these guys, stack them all season long. But even if you're playing daily fantasy this week, it might be worth just the extra salary to get these guys in because they have been playing so well all season long, and the matchup has been absolutely fantastic. So yes, I know it seems obvious, but hey, look, sometimes obvious is good. Sometimes we just need simple answers to things, and we can work harder at other spots on our lineup.
Exactly. I love that. All right, for my next stack, I'm taking it back to the top stack from week 11. It's Justin Herbert and Keenan Allen. I like to call them Herbie and Kiki. They're taking on the Atlanta Falcons. Now, Herbert, he did have a down week last week against the Patriots, but don't worry, he's poised for a comeback. The Falcons are allowing the most fantasy points to quarterbacks and are allowing an average of 2 passing touchdowns a game, which is tied for 5th most in the league. Now, if Herbert's going to throw into the end zone, chances are he's going to be targeting Keenan Allen, who's had a receiving touchdown in 5 of the last 6 games and is tied for the most targeted player in the league. Now, just as bad as the Falcons are against the quarterbacks, they're also pretty darn bad against wideouts, allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers. So please buckle up and get ready for these two guys to pop all the way off. Herbie, Kiki, I got my eyes on you.
Herbie and Kiki sounds like either a 70s soul duo or a show on Teen Nick. Either way, I do think big things are coming for them. In fact, I've got a little tease. I've got some big expectations for Justin Herbert later on this week. Meanwhile, my other stack, Russell Wilson and DK Metcalf, which a few weeks ago seemed like it was a sure thing. The last couple of weeks, Russell Wilson has not been that dude that we saw early in the season. But this feels like a bounce-back week for Danger Russ. The Jets have given up the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. In that same stretch, they've given up the 8th most to wide receivers, 8 touchdown passes allowed, just 1 interception. And look, Wilson and Metcalf, they are a great deep ball combination. You got a guy who's great at stretching the field with a quarterback who's excellent at throwing the deep ball. I expect they're going to hit a few long balls this week against the New York Jets, and I think you're going to see Russell Wilson kind of come back to where we saw him early in the year and end up with a pretty big week. So everybody who's been freaking out about Danger Russ, don't worry, the kitchen's going to be back open this week.
No more drive-through for Danger Russ. He's going back and he's going to chef it up.
And so we're hoping that this game makes it the best day ever here with Cynthia. She puts together a winning daily lineup. And as we always do, we will start with who is your MVP, the player that's going to get you 1.5 times the points tonight.
Going with Jared Goff in this matchup. Now, I'm not playing him in season-long formats at all. This is just because today is the best day ever. And for me, his 300 passing yards in 4 of the past 5 games is a nice indication. I don't like picking against this defense. What are you, nuts? But I do think that for the 1.5 times the points, this is where you want to go because we've seen Jared Goff be pretty efficient. So I think that we're going to see good Jared Goff like what we normally see on Thursday night as opposed to not so good.
All right, so now we got Goff in the MVP spot. You've got 4 flex options. Kickers are people too, so you can go with one of them if you choose to.
Okay, well, I'm going to go with Cam Newton next because you need both quarterbacks and his mobility is helpful. And then, again, I like Gerald Everett in this one. In terms of the tight end position, you really have to pick between one or the other of the Rams tight ends. And if you look to see what could potentially happen against the Patriots, I think for his price, the return on investment is higher for Everett. Yes, I know he only ranks 30th amongst tight ends in terms of points per game at 6.53, but he did have 10.1 in week 13 versus Arizona, which is last week. He does have more targets and receptions than Tyler Higbee this season, 4+ in 4 of the past 6 games.
All right, so then
And
your
then
other
do
two
you want
flex spots, where are you going to go? Yeah, please.
Well, yeah. So you know how you offered me the kicker position? I'm taking you up on it today. I almost never do that, but I'm going with Mac Gay. We saw some great stuff out of him, and if he makes Sean McVay that happy, he makes me that happy too. And then last but not least, that gives me enough money to get Cooper Kupp. I wanted to get Robert Woods, but he was a little too expensive. So Cooper Kupp is my 5th and final position, so my number 4 flex.
So very Ram heavy, not really a surprise considering the struggles of the Patriots offense, but there we go. Hopefully that helps everybody else make it the best day ever. In the meantime, Hanukkah does begin tonight, so we figured we would bring you our yearly tradition of 8 crazy starts. So Kimmy, as we go around and light the fantasy menorah, if you will, who is your first crazy start?
All right, my first crazy start is, dare I say, Jamison Crowder versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now, he's coming off of a huge game against the Raiders in Week 13, where he found the end zone twice and finished with almost 22 fantasy points. This week, he faces another favorable matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, who are dead last in the league, giving up the most fantasy points to fantasy wideouts. Now, being Sam Darnold's favorite slot receiver, I can see Jamison Crowder light it up in back-to-back weeks. So he's my first crazy start, and I'm sticking with it.
Your second crazy start this week is Cole Beasley, another slot receiver. He has been playing better as of late. In 2 of his last 3 games, he has over 27 fantasy points, over 11 targets, and over 100 receiving yards. So you've been getting a lot of production. And before you let the Steelers defense scare you away, just know that they have allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to slot wide receivers this year. And Cole Beasley runs nearly 90% of his routes out of the slot.
With the third crazy start, I'm taking CeeDee Lamb. That kind of worked out for me right there. At Cincinnati, he has double-digit fantasy points in 3 of his past 4 games. Cincinnati's allowed the 6th most receiving touchdowns to wide receivers this season, and I like his odds, especially because they need to get that win. Something's going on there in Dallas. I think that, they might be a little bit surprising. They need to get that W.
Well, your 4th crazy start, and we're getting crazy here, it's Sam Darnold going against the Seattle Seahawks, and you had Kimmy talking about Jamison Crowder, so why not his quarterback? I know the Seahawks defense has been better lately, but they're still prone to giving up some yards, plus just 2 interceptions over the last 4 games, and so maybe this is more of a daily play than in a season-long league. I don't know that you trust your playoffs to Sam Darnold, but there certainly is a story you can tell yourself in which Slinging Sammy ends up having a pretty good day against the Seahawks secondary.
For my 5th crazy start, I know our producer Moss is going to love this one. It's Jarvis Landry. The targets keep coming for this guy. Baker had himself a day back in Week 13, and so did Landry, who had 8 receptions on 10 targets and a touchdown. This is back-to-back weeks now with 20-plus fantasy points and a touchdown, so why not make it a 3-time streak? Now, I understand that he does face the Baltimore Ravens defense, who are 12th against wideouts, but I got the faith that Landry still got that juice, and we're being crazy. Well, why not fire up Jarvis Landry?
Our 6th crazy start is DJ Chark Jr. Going up against the Tennessee Titans. I know he disappointed you last week, but he did have a team-high 7 targets, including 4 of which that went for 20 or more air yards, and that's important because the Titans have allowed the 6th most catches of 20-plus air yards and the 3rd most touchdowns on passes of 20-plus air yards, and they've just allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers this year. So why not get a little crazy and start Chark this week?
Okay, so for our 7th crazy start, Drew Lock at Carolina. This is a daily play for me. It is a very strong daily play because of his price. I like the opportunity because Carolina has allowed a top 12 fantasy quarterback in 5 of their last 6 games, a top 3 fantasy quarterback in 3 of their last 4, and the 3rd most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position since Week 9. I love this for tournaments.
Well, my 8th and final crazy start is Colin Johnson against the Tennessee Titans. And Florio just talked a little bit about DJ Chark. So I'm going to go with his teammate, the rookie who has picked it up in the last couple of games. Over the last 2 games, 8 catches for $162 and 1 touchdown. That's on 14 targets. The Titans secondary struggling mightily, 3rd highest fantasy points per game allowed to the wide receiver position. And again, this may be more of a daily play, but certainly worth taking a shot at considering how the rookie has started to pick things up. So there you go, 8 crazy starts and happy Hanukkah.
Welcome back to NFL Fantasy Live. It is time for My 5. And if you are one of the lucky ones taking part in your Fantasy League's fantasy playoffs, then go ahead and sit back, relax, and watch your studs do their thing. That's why I'm here to bring you my 5 guys who are going to score 25-plus fantasy points who are not quarterbacks in Week 14. Let's kick it off at number 5. It's David Montgomery versus the Houston Texans. Now, Montgomery has been incredible the last few weeks, scoring 25-plus points in 2 straight contests. His nearly 4.5 receptions a game since Week 5 ranks 5th amongst running backs, giving him a huge upside, especially this Sunday against the Houston Texans, who are allowing the most rushing yards and the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs this season. Number 4, Adam Thielen at Tampa Bay. Now, I love both Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson this week against the Buccaneers, but Thielen specifically has hauled in 12 receiving touchdowns and has 25-plus fantasy points in 4 games this season. Plus, that Bucs D has been a soft matchup lately as they've allowed 25-plus fantasy points to 3 different wideouts in the last 2 games combined. Number 3, it's the OGAP versus the Green Bay Packers. He's stepping it up in the absence of DeAndre Swift. 17-plus points in 2 straight games, entering the matchup heaven against the Packers this week. Green Bay obviously allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to running back and surrendering 25-plus points to 4 different backs this season. Number 2, we're getting down to it. Derrick Henry versus Jacksonville. Now, this name is not a surprise at all, and I know people were bummed over last week's performance, but he's got a huge bounce back in store Sunday against Jacksonville, who are allowing the 3rd most scrimmage yards and the 4th most fantasy points to running backs. His 109 rushing yards per game is the 2nd most in the league. No surprise for the stud fantasy performer. Justin, you know the deal. It's drum roll time. Drum roll me. Number 1. Devontae Adams at Detroit. You heard Marcus hyping him up earlier, and he may be one of the only people to truly thrive in the year 2020. He's had 18-plus fantasy points in 7 straight games and 25-plus points in 5 games this season, the most amongst wide receivers. His almost 27 fantasy point average this season is the 2nd most by a wide receiver in NFL history, taking on Detroit Sunday, who are allowing the 2nd most points per game to NFL this season. He is an absolute stud and an absolute must-start. All right, those are my 5 non-quarterbacks that are going to score 25 or more points in Week 14.
As Christian McCaffrey is one of those high-priced guys, but as we mentioned earlier, not likely to play this week for the Carolina Panthers. In the meantime, Cynthia is here and going to profile some of the best daily values that you can find across those different sites, platforms this week. So let's start off, though, with Matt Ryan. Matty Ice going against the Los Angeles Chargers. What are you projecting for him this week?
So I have 275 passing yards and 2 touchdowns projected. I'm trying to always look for the people who are going to get you about 2 points or more per every 1,000 in your fake salary. So for me, Matt Ryan's upside here is tremendous given the fact that he's not priced super high. The Chargers are allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position this season at 20.5. So my projection for him is even kind of a bit lower than that, which means you could have even more upside in this one.
All right, fresh off of a bye week, got Teddy Bridgewater. So what are you looking at for Teddy 2 gloves against Denver?
Okay, he is the 17th most expensive quarterback on DraftKings. That is incredibly El Cheapo. And that means that his 254 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, an interception, and 17 rush yards, which is about 17.86 fantasy points. That's going to be a nice ROI. We're going to use some banking words here because I got to use my MBA sometimes. And this ROI really reflects the fact that this is a game where they've had 2 weeks to figure it out, and they're going to use a nice Robbie Anderson situation going on between the 2 of them.
Let's turn over to some running back values. Let's start with Jonathan Taylor taking on the Raiders. What are you looking at?
So this is an interesting one because we've seen this Raiders defense reeling. I have 50 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 2 receptions, and 12 receiving yards. That's the median projection. There's a huge upside for Taylor in this one. The only reason he's tempered is because we could potentially see them go to a different running back. But he's number 24 in terms of how expensive he is. So that return is going to also be kind of close to that 2 or 2+ times value.
Just hoping that maybe the Colts are having some clarity in their backfield, sort of like what we're seeing with the Rams. Maybe it's more Jonathan Taylor. You see some good value, though, in Gio Bernard against the Cowboys, who are giving up the 7th most fantasy points to running backs this year, don't you?
I do. So it really didn't catch up with the pricing without Joe Mixon. He's number 37 in terms of price, and his 72 rushing yards, rushing touchdown, 2 receptions, and 13 receiving yards. That equates to 16.5 fantasy points. So that's a really nice situation to be in here. You can pay up for some other more expensive positions. And Dallas's defense has allowed a top 20 fantasy running back in 7 of 9, and they're allowing the most rushing yards per game this season at 167.8.
So we've talked a lot about the Packer passing game on this show, but what about the running game? Aaron Jones taking on your Detroit Lions.
Yeah, I don't know if they're mine anymore. I might be in the market for a new team. Just kidding. I'm nothing if not loyal. He's the fourth most expensive running back on DraftKings on the slate. However, there's a good reason for that. Not only is his production great, but the opportunity is exceptional. So I have 69 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 4 receptions, 36 receiving yards. That's the median. He has 2 touchdown upside quite easily. It's almost at that second touchdown spot. I mean, I could tell you all these stats about how much Detroit is giving up to the running back position, but just play in your Aaron Jones and you'll be really, really happy. It's like my Christmas gift to you or Hanukkah gift. Just depends on what you celebrate.
It says a lot about his potential production that a guy like Aaron Jones can be considered a value, considering what he's done this year. All right, a sneaky play from Tampa's offense this week, Antonio Brown against the Vikings, huh?
Yep. Wide receiver number 31s in terms of price. I have 4 receptions, 51 yards, and a touchdown for him. So for me, that's an interesting one. You know, this would be his first receiving touchdown, so you want to take part in that.
And see, a tight end. Nice value with Dalton Schultz against the Bengals this week.
Yep, 4 receptions, 39 yards, and a touchdown projected. He's the 20th most expensive tight end. Tight end's a position that I always look for a value on, and I think Dalton Schultz is number 1 value for the entire week at that position. So I'm making a lot of lineups with him in it.
A good spot always to find some value at tight end. Fire up that burner account. We know you got questions that you were just, asking for a friend. We got some of your Week 14 lineup questions that you have for us, which is on social media, and we're going to try to help you out the best we can. So start with this one for you, Michael F. Florio. Josh wanting to know, Edwards-Helaire, Jamison Crowder, or Juju for the flex?
This might be surprising, but I'm going to go with Jamison Crowder here of the 3, Josh. He gets Seattle this week, who have allowed the most fantasy points per game and yards per game to wide receivers, but they've allowed the most specifically to slot receivers this season, and that is where Jamison Crowder runs about 90% of his routes. Plus, Sam Darnold has thrown 35% of his passes to the slot this year, and with Denzel Mims not playing this week, I think it only leads to even more volume for Jamison Crowder. I would go ahead and use him of those 3 options this week.
All right, next one to you, Kimmy. This one from Pete asking, Tom Brady rested off a bye week, or do I start a fantasy slumping Russell Wilson?
Anytime I ever go against Tom Brady, he goes out and balls. So I've learned a lesson here, and I'm going to rock with Tom Brady. He has such a good matchup against the Minnesota Vikings this week, who have allowed the 5th most passing touchdowns this season and the 8th most passing yards per game to quarterbacks. Brady has had 21 plus fantasy points and 2 plus passing TDs in 3 straight. We know Russell's been struggling, so why don't you go ahead and fire up TB12?
Cynthia, this one is for you from Andres, who wants to know Tyler Lockett or Robbie Anderson in the flex in a 1-point PPR.
You know, I'm going with Robbie Anderson in this situation. Tyler Lockett does get the Jets, I understand, but that's a game script that I don't like as much. This is going to be a competitive game, and Robbie has had just a really great season, right? Double-digit fantasy points in 10 games. Lockett's only had it in 7, just if we're keeping track that way. And if you look to see where this defense is vulnerable, it's going to be the Robbie Anderson comeback show in this matchup. I really like Robbie Anderson this week overall.
Our next question comes from Nando, which I presume is short for Nandalorian, asking better flex starter, Ayuk, T. Higgins, or Mostert. I'm going to go with the rookie Brandon Ayuk here, one of the 2 rookie receivers you got. I'm going to go Brandon Ayuk here, who's been really fantastic in fairly limited amounts this year, but 17 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games, 75 receiving yards and or a touchdown in all of those games. And even though the matchup against Washington looks sort of scary on paper, over the last 4 weeks, they have been giving up quite a few receptions to wideouts. 70 receptions allowed. That is 3rd most. The Niners have been very creative about getting the ball in Ayuk's hands, so I feel pretty confident about him. All right, Floro, this one back to you. This one from Joe. Moss or Edmonds says, trust me, there are no other options at this point. It's a deep league.
Yeah, we're diving deep here. I'm going to go with Chase Edmonds because at least he can catch some passes out of the backfield and Kenyon Drake is banged up. Who knows what you're going to get out of Moss this week, especially in a tough matchup against Pittsburgh.
All right, Kimmy, Herb wants to know, Logan Thomas or Noah Fant? I have an idea. I know where you're going.
I gotta go with my guy Noah Fant on this one. Plus, he does have a better matchup against the Carolina Panthers. So yes, my guy Noah Fant all the way.
All right, and this one for you, Cynthia. Marquise Brown or CeeDee Lamb? Who should start there?
I'm going CeeDee Lamb in this one. Come on, you got to take the guy who's going to get more of an opportunity there. Marquise Brown is a harder situation to be in.
And last one from Will's asking Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, or Taysom Hill. This feels like a humble brag, but I'm going to go with Justin Herbert. I think this is a huge bounce-back game against the Falcons in a game that I think could be pretty high scoring between these 2 teams. There you go. Thank you for all your questions. Best of luck in your playoff match. Time now for Call Me Crazy, but our Week 14 predictions that might leave some folks out there scratching their heads. So, Kimmy, check. Start us off. Let's get crazy.
I'm like already giggling before I even say it, but I'm sticking to my guns on this one. Call me crazy, but Colt McCoy is going to outscore Kyler Murray this week. We understand that Kyler Murray has been dealing with a shoulder injury, which has impacted his rushing upside. Meanwhile, Colt McCoy is just happy to be out there playing football. The Giants are a lot tougher on quarterbacks than you would imagine, whereas the Cardinals have allowed top 12 quarterbacks in 3 of the last 4 games. So YOLO, Colt McCoy, go fire him up.
Call me crazy, but I think that T. Higgins and CeeDee Lamb are going to score more touchdowns combined than Julio Jones and Keenan Allen. They're both facing off against each other, and I think the young Bucks, they beat the old Bucks. Is that what an old thing is? Whatever. The old ponies, let's call them that, in this matchup this weekend.
Call me crazy, but I think Derrick Henry starts his Todd Gurley-esque playoff run with over 40 fantasy points this week. Remember back in 2017 when Todd Gurley averaged over 41 points per game in the fantasy playoffs and won everyone a championship? I think Derrick Henry could go on a run like that. Starting this week, he gets the Jaguars, the Lions, and the Packers. And those 3 teams, what do they have in common? They're all in the top 4 in teams allowing the most fantasy points per game to running backs. I think he has a huge playoff run starting this week.